Hello, this is the first in a series of videos on the notation and terminology that we use in vibrational astrology for midpoints, for aspects, and all kinds of planetary configurations. We're going to build this from the ground up, from the very basics to advanced planetary configurations. Whether you're a beginner, an intermediate, or professional vibrational astrologer, these videos can help because, number one, some of these fundamental ideas, fundamental notation has not really been explained clearly. It's more or less been assumed that you are familiar with these ideas already, and you may not be, and people have started assuming different things about this basic terminology. And also for some of the advanced concepts, we've simplified it. We've streamlined the terminology. We've removed some of the terms that we were using before and introduce some new things to simplify it. This is important because as vibrational astrology has advanced, we have more and more things that we're interpreting, and the language started to get very cumbersome. Okay, so that older terminology can still be used, but we have some new language for particular things that I think everyone is going to agree is clearly easier to work with and just more direct and simpler. Okay, so let's get into it from the ground up. What is a midpoint? Okay, I'll go through these essentials, very basic things very quickly because you know what a midpoint is. But let's just make it clear. A midpoint is the point halfway between two planets. So let's look at the actress Julia Roberts. Here's her birth chart. Her Mercury is at 13 Scorpio. Her Jupiter is at 1 Virgo. Going halfway in between the shortest distance. So the midpoint, the shortest distance, going to be somewhere over here in Libra. If we go to midpoints, view change settings, and we check this box for a 360-degree sort, we can look in here around late Virgo to early Libra for Mercury Jupiter, and here we see it at 7 Libra 37. Let me stretch this out a little bit to make it easier for you to see that. You can probably see it now right up here, 7 Libra 37. So that is the midpoint of Mercury and Jupiter for Julia Roberts. Second thing, okay, that you probably already know. Second thing you probably know as well, that the slash indicates the midpoint. So this notation, Sun/Mars, means the midpoint of Sun and Mars. And very often we say Sun-Mars midpoint. That's the kind of a fast way to say it. Instead of saying the midpoint of Sun and Mars or something, we just say the Sun-Mars midpoint. That's the typical fast way when you're talking to refer to a midpoint. And notice that if you write out Sun/Mars midpoint, it's redundant. Sun/Mars already means midpoint, right? So to say Sun/Mars midpoint, we've essentially said midpoint twice. We put the slash in, and then we also said midpoint. So the word midpoint is not needed. You can just say Sun/Mars. That already indicates the midpoint. However, sometimes if you're writing out an article or an email or whatever, and you're referring to a midpoint, and the person you're communicating with is not a person who is experienced in using midpoints, sometimes that redundancy is helpful so that they know Sun/Mars midpoint makes it very clear. It's good to use the slash because that's the character used. That slash means midpoint. This was established not by vibrational astrologers, but much earlier with the use of Uranian astrology and cosmobiology. This notation has already been established. Okay. And by the way, sometimes people who are not experienced in using midpoints will use slashes. So they'll say I have here, people may write Sun/Mars conjunction to mean that Sun and Mars are conjunct. I see this very frequently, a slash being used. This is incorrect and unacceptable in VA because slash always means midpoint. So you would never say Sun/Mars conjunction. Whoa, it looks totally and absolutely confusing, not only to people in vibrational astrology, but to people in cosmobiology, Uranian astrology, etc. Okay, so I'm just making sure these things are clear. Now the term far midpoint, you're probably familiar with this as well, but just to make sure we're not missing anything, that's the point opposite the midpoint. So the far midpoint is also equidistant. I think I have an image of this here. Let's look at an image. Here's a different chart. We've got the moon at 24 Leo 47, sun at 4 Scorpio 03. The midpoint, if you calculate that out, happens to be 29 Virgo 25. So 29 Virgo 25 is the sun moon midpoint. We can just put sun/moon to indicate that it's the midpoint. The far midpoint means the opposite point, 29 Pisces 25. So if someone says, Sally's sun moon far midpoint is 29 Pisces 25, that's what that means. It's the opposite point. And notice that the far midpoint is also a midpoint. It's also halfway in between the sun and moon. In other words, the distance of the moon at 24 Leo 47 to 29 Pisces 25, and the distance from the sun at 4 Scorpio 03 to 29 Pisces 25 is the same. Obviously, it's the same. So, when you're first working with midpoints, that you may not think of that. You're just thinking midpoint, and you just go to that point halfway in between. But remember that opposite point, the far midpoint, is also a kind of a midpoint. Okay. And if you want to distinguish the midpoint, what we usually call the midpoint, from the far midpoint, we have the term near midpoint. So for Julia Roberts, the far midpoint is 7 Aries 37, and the near midpoint is 7 Libra 37. So you can use the term near midpoint when you're wanting to distinguish between the near midpoint and the far midpoint. Now, here's where it starts to get a little confusing. An alternative meaning for midpoint. Sometimes we use the word midpoint to mean that closest distance, that 29 Virgo 25 for the sun and moon. That's the midpoint. However, in some contexts, the word midpoint can mean either 29 Virgo 25 or 29 Pisces 25 in this case. So you have to tell from the context when the word midpoint is used. Does midpoint mean near midpoint, or does it mean either the near midpoint or the far midpoint? So that may seem confusing, but there's a lot of situations in life where we use a word to have slightly different meanings depending on context. So usually midpoint means near midpoint. So if I say, Joe's sun-moon midpoint, usually I'm talking about the near midpoint. But there are some situations, and I'll give you an example right now, where midpoint can refer to either the near midpoint or the far midpoint. So here's an example. Someone says she has sun at the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. Okay, let's think about this, because you'll hear this a lot. I may say, Maria has sun at the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. What do I mean exactly when I say Maria has sun at Mars-Jupiter midpoint? In that context, I'm saying that the sun is a focal point for Mars-Jupiter, and in this context, the sun might be conjunct the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, or it might be opposition the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, right? So, and if it's opposition the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, that means it's conjunct the far midpoint, right? So it could be any way, it could be at either point. So the bottom line is this: if someone says, my sun is at the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, it means the sun is conjunct or opposition that midpoint in vibrational astrology. Now, in other systems of astrology, like cosmobiology, it could have a slightly different meaning, and that's why, not even slightly different, it can have a different meaning. But that's why it's good for us to go over these basics in VA language. So when you step into the world of VA and we say sun is at Mars-Jupiter midpoint, what does it mean? It means the sun is conjunct or opposition the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. Another way of saying this is that the sun is conjunct either the near midpoint or the far midpoint. Okay. All right. If you want to be specific about it, you would simply say she has sun conjunct the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. If you want to be specific, but if you don't need to distinguish whether it's a conjunction or opposition, you can use the word at and say sun is at the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. Now this leads to an awareness that these near and far midpoint, sometimes we don't really distinguish them. We'll just say a planet is at the midpoint, meaning it's either at the near midpoint or far midpoint. And these 2 points, near and far midpoint, are sometimes referred to as the midpoint axis. So you'll hear this term a lot. You'll hear it a lot in vibrational astrology. You'll also hear it a lot in the earlier systems of astrology. I mean, they were developed earlier, such as cosmobiology and Uranian astrology. All people that use midpoints will sometimes refer to the midpoint axis. Midpoint axis just means that you have this line that goes from one point to the opposite point, and they are both midpoints of the sun and moon. Okay, so when we're referring to either the near midpoint or the far midpoint, sometimes we'll use the term midpoint axis to make it clear. When you say midpoint axis, it makes it clear that you're talking about it. It might be conjunct the midpoint, the near midpoint, or it might be opposition, and I don't care in a particular context. I might say the sun is on the sun-moon midpoint axis. Or some people would use at. They'll say the sun-moon is at the midpoint. Usually you'd say on. The sun-moon is on. I mean, you could say it's Jupiter. Jupiter is on the sun-moon midpoint axis. Means Jupiter's either, in this case, a 29 Virgo or 29 Pisces. Okay. All right, and another term for midpoint axis is symmetry axis. The idea here is that these midpoints are lines of symmetry because the sun and moon are equidistant from this axis. So this axis makes a mirror image where the sun and moon are like reflections of each other. They are equally spaced from the midpoint axis. And that's why another term for midpoint axis is symmetry axis. And sometimes we use the term midpoint axis just to emphasize. We're emphasizing the fact that we're focusing on symmetry. But in any case, you can use either the term midpoint axis or symmetry axis to refer to this line. Okay, and in vibrational astrology, we often use the term symmetry axis because symmetry means that the angular distance is equal. The distance of the sun to the sun-moon midpoint is the same as the distance of the moon to the sun-moon midpoint. By definition, that's what the midpoint axis is. It's a symmetry axis, and it's a point where angular distances are the same. And when angular distances are the same, It's like having two strings that are the same size and same length, and they vibrate at the same frequency, at the same note. So symmetry is a important concept in vibrational astrology. So you'll often hear it referred to as a symmetry axis, and then you may also hear the person referring to resonance, that the symmetry, for example, in vibrational astrology, you might say there's a lot of resonance going on because a planet is on the midpoint axis. So, for example, suppose there were two planets on the Sun-Moon midpoint axis. Suppose Mars is conjunct the midpoint and Jupiter's at the far midpoint. So you have a Mars opposition Jupiter on the Sun-Moon midpoint axis. That means there's a lot of symmetry and there's a lot of resonance. So resonance can occur in many, many ways, but this is why we often refer to the midpoint axis as a symmetry axis and relating it to the idea of resonance. Also, what's interesting is that symmetry and resonance are fundamental principles in areas of science, such as quantum physics, and they are fundamental in VA as well. So you often see these similarities between quantum theory or other areas, quantum biology, different areas of science and mathematics with vibrational astrology, speaking very similar language. And we think that's not a coincidence. I mean, maybe it is a coincidence. We're not using these ideas to imitate science. We're using them because we get positive results in our controlled research studies. We get positive results in our consultations. You know, they work and they happen to be extremely similar to ideas in science. So we'll often use terminology that maintains that consistency because it's there. Okay, so we're using the same terms used in other environments. Now, next term, midpoint structure. Okay, we're going over basics here. Probably you're familiar with this as well, but let's go over it. Because the meaning of midpoint structure in vibrational astrology is different from the meaning of midpoint structure in other systems of astrology like cosmobiology and Uranian astrology. And in fact, the meaning of midpoint structure in cosmobiology is different from the meaning of midpoint structure in Uranian. So all three systems, Uranian astrology, cosmobiology, and vibrational astrology, use the term midpoint structure differently in their most common use of the terms. So in VA, in vibrational astrology, a midpoint structure occurs when a planet is conjunct or opposition the midpoint of two other planets. So here we have Julia Roberts, the actress. This is her birth chart. Her Jupiter at 1 Virgo, 22. Mercury at 13 Scorpio, 53. The midpoint of Mercury and Jupiter is 7 Libra, 37, as we noticed when we looked at the listing. And Saturn at 7 Aries, 09 is opposition. So I've drawn this line with a big opposition symbol. Saturn is opposition the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint. It's not perfectly opposition because there's a bit of an orb there. Saturn's at 7 Aries, 09. What is the far midpoint? It's the opposite of the near point. It's 7 Aries, 37. So 7 Aries, 37 minus 7 Aries, 09 is 28 minutes if you do the arithmetic. So there's an orb of 28 minutes. And we'll go over the orb, or I say here 29 minutes. It could be a rounding issue. But anyway, 28, 29 minutes. Saturn is at that midpoint, and that's a small orb. We'll find out. We'll talk about orbs. Well, I'll tell you right now. The maximum orb we use in vibrational astrology is 1.5 degrees. That is smaller than is often used in cosmobiology, where they'll go up to a 2.5 degree orb. We're only going to 1.5 degrees. So use smaller orbs, and we don't think this midpoint structure is really super strong till you get under a degree. But it's there. It's definitely there to a degree and a half. And you know, very, very subtle, it does extend beyond a degree and a half. But typically we're ignoring these very, very subtle impacts and just cut it off at a degree and a half. But actually I think it does extend beyond the degree and a half, but very, very weak. Okay. So in vibrational astrology, a midpoint structure is a planet conjunct or opposition the midpoint within a degree and a half orb. And a midpoint structure involves 3 planets, and this is a midpoint structure. Julia Roberts has Saturn opposition the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint with a 29-minute orb. That's her midpoint structure. Okay, and here's how we can write it. We can write Saturn op Mer/Jupiter. Some systems, they like to use 2-letter abbreviations. You can use a 2-letter abbreviation if you want to. I tend to use a 3-letter abbreviation, but either one is okay. We don't force you to use a 2-letter or 3-letter abbreviation in vibrational astrology. Of course, if you want to spell it out, you can do that as well. But there it is, Saturn op MER/JUP. That is a typical notation to indicate this planetary configuration that we see in the chart wheel. And optionally, you can include the orb. So if you're sending somebody an email, or you're reading an article, or writing an article, or whatever the situation is, a good way to do this is just to write Saturn op, or SAT op MER/JUP space 29 apostrophe thing means minutes. 29 minutes. And you don't have to write the word orb. It's assumed the 29 minutes refers to the orb. And so that orb will go anywhere from 0 to 1 degree 30 minutes typically is how we usually do it. So that's a midpoint structure in vibrational astrology. And like I said, in other systems, it can be a little different. And specifically in cosmobiology, they use other aspects. They'll use a planet square the midpoint of 2 other planets, as well as semi-square or sesquiquadrat. And in Uranian astrology, they use even more aspects. But we use only conjunction and opposition in VA. But this is huge. This is an enormous difference from those other systems. In VA, we look at midpoint structures in vibrational charts. We believe that they are extremely powerful and important. So in cosmobiology, they don't use vibrational charts, more commonly called harmonic charts. If you're familiar with cosmobiology, you know that they use what are called dials, like the 90-degree dial. But a 90-degree dial is still an analysis of what is in the natal chart. It is not a vibrational chart. So, and they're not analyzing it the way we would do a vibrational chart. Let me say one more thing about it. Just for people that are into cosmobiology, otherwise you can, this maybe is a little bit advanced if you're not familiar with it, is that vibrational charts do what we call scaling. They adjust the orbs as you go up. So you can always use a 1.5 degree orb, and dials do not scale. They do not adjust the orb appropriately as you go to higher vibrations. And so they're not vibrational charts, and they don't give you the same information, even though there are some similarities. Okay, so I just wanted to make that clear, because your orbs would be just wildly incorrect from the vibrational astrology viewpoint. If you use cosmobiology dials, you have to use vibrational charts, which are more commonly called harmonic charts. Okay, outside of the world of VA, they're called harmonic charts. We don't call them harmonic charts because we believe that what the chart tells you is the vibrations. It's simple. We're just looking at vibrations. A vibration is a very simple idea. When you hear the word harmonics, oh my God, when we talk about harmonies and all kinds of stuff, it's more complicated than it needs to be. So we want to keep things simple and to the point of what we're talking about. Okay, I'll give you a few more terms. Let's see, we are at 25 minutes. I'm going to keep these to about a half hour long. So let's see how many more things we cover in 5 minutes. We're doing well. This is what I want to do in the first half hour, is cover some of the basic terminology. Midpoint tree. So a midpoint tree is a diagram that shows midpoint structures. On the right side, we see midpoint trees. That's a midpoint tree. Remember that Julia Roberts in her natal chart has Saturn opposition the Mercury-Jupiter midpoint with a 29-minute orb. This is how you write that as a midpoint tree. The planet in the middle, I have this right on the screen, focal planet, the planet that's at the midpoint we call the focal planet. That's the planet that is conjunct or opposition to other planets. So what is the focal planet in this midpoint structure? It's Saturn. Very simple. So Saturn is the focal planet of the midpoint structure, and that's what it looks like in a midpoint tree. These midpoint trees that are used extensively in cosmobiology, Reinhold Everton used them extensively. They are wonderful. They're a wonderful invention, and we rely on them. They help us visualize exactly what is happening more clearly than writing it out or any other way. It's a very simple idea. That's the midpoint tree. Now, this is a midpoint tree in the upper right corner that was produced by the Sirius software. But just to make the terminology clear, and in some contexts you don't need to include all this information, these three little images in the bottom right corner are also midpoint trees. You do not need to include the aspect where this little cross is. See, the opposition glyph is put in there to tell us it's an opposition. That's not required to be a tree, a midpoint tree. It's also not required to include the orb. So this image in the lower right, Saturn at the top with Mercury and Jupiter on the sides, that's also a midpoint tree. Whether you include the aspect, whether you include the orb, whether you include both, is up to you. It's obviously extremely handy to have it if you're interpreting, but sometimes you just want to convey a general thought or whatever, or you're looking at some other source of this information outside of VA. Other people don't always include all that information. Okay, so that's a midpoint tree. The way we typically look at midpoint trees in vibrational astrology is the one in the upper right corner. But you can use these others, and in some other systems of astrology, it's more common to do it in one of these kind of ways. Particularly in many systems, they never put the aspect in here. That's something that I actually hadn't seen that before. I just introduced that. But anyway, those are the variations. We're making this clear because it's gotten confusing by not explaining exactly what's going on. So some people are thinking, that diagram in the lower right corner is incomplete, it's incorrect. No, it's okay. That's what the first midpoint trees, back over 50 years ago looked like when people were drawing them, and it's fine if that's all you want to communicate. Okay. All right, we are at 29 minutes into this video. This is a good place to stop. I want to spend about up to a half hour on each one of these. This will be a series of a lot of videos. There's a lot of terminology we want to go over, but just to give you a preview for what we're headed into in the next video in this series, we're going to talk about direct midpoint structures and indirect midpoint structures. And pretty soon we're going to be getting to the advanced, or complex or new, I don't know if they're actually more complex or whatever, but the new stuff that is part of the heart of vibrational astrology. But I want to build it up from the ground up make sure we haven't missed anything. I have found out recently that some people who are professional level vibrational astrologers, I never really went back and explained what we mean when we say at. When I say, Saturn is at the Mercury Jupiter midpoint, just kind of, how it is when you know something, you forget to explain it all. So let's make it clear completely so there's no confusion. Okay. All right. We'll stop here and we'll pick up with this slide in the next video in this series. Thank you very much, my friends. God bless. Namaste.